just wanted to thank all the people that we don't know that help make this happen. So it's a lot of support that we're getting from staff and students, and I just want to list off those people. Julie Ron is a program secretary, and she helps communicate with the artists that come. Does a wonderful job in giving them a lot of information, and is supremely helpful. And in electronic media, Ben Haggart and David Crampton. And then students, John Thompson, Mariana Urban, Ethan Camp, Aj Kumbelik, Taylor Sikorsky, Lisa Lizarraga, Daniel Purcell, Julia Logan, Keegan O'Neill, and Davey Wojcik have also been helpful in recording all of these, and they will be available on YouTube. And also we're trying to set up a system where there'll be DVDs in the library and people can watch them at their leisure in the future, so we'll keep them archived. Miranda is going to introduce our final speaker for the year.
Hi guys, welcome to the last art lecture of the year, Cassie Thronton. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce Cassie, but by way of beginning with a short writing exercise. Go figure, surprise, surprise. So take out pen and paper. And I'm going to ask you to write, this is just going to be 1 or 2 minutes, and here's the prompt. The prompt is to write down something that you avoid looking at or turning towards, something we might call monstrous or your monster, something that you also know that you need to turn towards, right? It could be a political issue, it could be a social anxiety, it could be a personal memory. It's something that on some level you know you need to turn yourself towards, but that you habitually turn away from. And this is your, we'll call it for now, provisionally, monster. So take a minute to just think about what this is and write it down. First thought, best thought. Okay, so I'm going to move us on. But so in this action, which you can pick back up later, you've externalized this monster and you've turned towards it. Well, I did this exercise with Cassie Thronton 5 years ago in a class I taught at California College of the Arts called The Monster is the Message. Cassie was an MFA student in social practice there at the time, and I was teaching, and Cassie's monster, the thing that she decided to turn towards, was debt, student debt. In fact, during this time, at this incredibly expensive art school, Cassie had this startling and profound revelation that the art she was producing was debt. That was the art she was making. Since that time, she's gone on to take this art and show it in a range of forms and contexts, from galleries to workplaces, speaking on the matter at some 20 or more colleges and other institutions, developing her ideas at various residencies, including most recently in Finland, Miami, and the Bay Area. Cassie has collaborated with Debt Collective and Strike Debt, and recently founded the Feminist Economics Department. She looks at economics to flip the script, to look for soft places and ask how things could be otherwise by doing things like, for example, setting up an alternative credit rating agency where she interviews people with bad credit with the goal of restoring their credence by asking something that many of us never are asked or never ask with regards to economics and debt. What is the real story? And there the interview begins. Her research on credit rating led her to discover that the credit rating system was first invented by an abolitionist in the 1890s. In collaboration with an astrologer, she has had this founding moment's astrological chart done. Turns out the credit rating system's Chiron is in Cancer. Recently, Cassie has been thinking about economics and outer space as student debt becomes huge, unfathomable, so as to begin to seem as infinite and mysterious as the cosmos. The brave, the courageous, the brilliant Cassie Thornton. Please give her a warm welcome.
Now? Oh, wow. Okay. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you so much. What an amazing welcome. So, a couple of months ago, somebody from Portland asked me if I wanted to publish a book, and I was like, well, I don't even know what that is, really. But so I just did, and I forgot to bring it and show it to you guys, but I was going to read kind of a condensed version of it right now, and then I was going to talk about two projects. We'll see what we have time for. So I'm going to start with this meteor in prison. What does success look like for an artist? I don't know, but I have a sense of what failure is, the inability to take risks. One large risk I've taken, along with millions of other American students, is to take on tens of thousands of dollars in educational loans. This specific financial risk distracts us from unprofitable ideas by forcing our focus to remain on working to repay our debts. These loans for our education are in themselves educational in this way. They teach us to value employability above all else as we spend our lives narrowly avoiding financial failure. Does anyone in here have any student debt? I estimate that among the 47 people in my class, we produced $3.4 million of student debt in 2 years. How could we ever make that much art? This tension, created by this unspeakable imbalance, produced an anxiety that shaped the feeling of everyone and everything in this art school. It affected the type of work produced by students, their core values, interests, and it imposed a culture of relative normativity, which included making a lot of art out of aluminum foil. Sometimes the art studios at school looked like an airport shopping mall filled with well-displayed shrapnel, because we were readied for the market before we ever knew what we would make or why. So I believe that debt is less about finance and much more about an unarticulated fear. Fear of financial failure drives most people's ideas of success. Success equals not failing financially. Fear limits risk. Theoretically, artists produce and circulate risk by asking questions that no one else can or will, kind of identifying the elephant in the room. By signing up for all that debt, I felt that my risk quota had already been met. I decided that my most potent art-making material was debt itself, as Miranda had said. By calling debt forward, I found a way to create risk with pre-existing, low-cost, high-impact material. So my goal has been ever since to suspend the power that debt has over me and over the people around me, so that I could study it as a common material shared by everybody, shared by everyone. I re-articulated my bad investment and future economic failure as a political decision. I proposed that collective debt could create an opportunity for solidarity among debtors. So at one point in grad school, I made a little debt. This little debt of mine was made of brass. I made 50. I did this while living on student loans. For a year, I collected all of my receipts from living on student loans, and I paper-machéed them into little bundles. So the BPAs in the receipts that I paper-machéed together created this glossy surface on the bundles. And after I finished it, I learned in the New York Times that probably the BPAs also changed my hormonal balances. But the BPAs made this glossy surface on the bundles, but the inside of each debt bundle stayed soft. Each bundle represented a kind of debt funded by student loans used to pay for basic, ordinary needs. So this one is for transportation, but there was one for healthcare and food and coffee. And then a friend helped me make the bundles into molds. We cast them first in rubber and then in bronze. And they came out like little rocks or pebbles, like very, very heavy pebbles, much denser than actual pebbles, maybe more like meteorites. I paid a younger, craftier student to take the debts out of the molds and clean them, but I never picked up the whole collection. I only took the first 5. So I've only ever had 5 of these little debts, actually, even though there were 50. And I think it's because I'm just not used to waiting. I'm so used to getting things that I want right now. I'll pay for the consequences later. I just want it today. And I assume that now the rest of my little debts have been melted back down, and probably the bronze has been used to make really heavily beautiful sculptures financed by other students' debt. As an artist, I rarely make physical objects. These little debts felt very precious to me. I found myself carrying them around with me wherever I went. They're quite heavy, though. They're debt, but for some reason, carrying them around with me in my backpack at all times felt like a good omen. It protected my existence as an artist. It made my abstract practice into something that I could hold or pass or even throw. But I did have a lot of anxiety around the responsibility of having these objects. I didn't understand their value, which is probably why I brought them in my backpack when I got on the plane, which I'll tell you about later.
I love what you do, but I hate what you make. Thank you. Hello. I love what you do, but I hate what you make.
Said the internationally renowned curator.
It is not bronze, it is brass.
Said the pawnbroker.
It is worth nothing.
Said the poet.
I want to buy one for $1,000.
Said my friend, a metaphysically homeless novelist.
You should meet my friend who does product design.
Said my friend, the entrepreneur. The debt market investor avoided appraising it altogether. I continued to carry the little debt around with me. I had a show in New York City, and then I was invited to have another. Everybody was so excited to look at my debt. I continued to carry my little debt around with me. I put the little debt on the table during initial meetings with curators, and I was sometimes embarrassed by my compulsive desire to show people my debt. Sometimes I would say, it's a currency. Other times I'd confess that I was hoping for somebody to be able to appraise it, which would be to give it value, or at least offer some sort of acknowledgement. On a red eye from San Francisco to New York, an uncle who worked for United upgraded my seat to first class. I sat down next to a man who resembled Harrison Ford. He was crisp, in full focus, a real blue blood if such a thing exists. He was a financier, and I'd never seen anybody like him before.
So what do you do, paint?
He asked. I make art about economics, debt specifically, I told him.
I work in finance too, as does everyone else in this section.
He said, pointing to the first class. As we chatted, his serene power gave way to something much more approachable. I wasn't sure what made me want to talk to him so much. Was it his proximity to everything unknown and forbidden to me? Because of our class differences? Was it the power of his presence, which seemed so formidable? Or because he could fund every one of my dream projects with his budget for socks? He talked about his life and his isolation from people like me. He had gone to Harvard and Columbia and then Princeton. He has 2 kids, too many degrees, a perfect yoga wife, a family in Manhattan he can't stand, and he feels like he's missing out. We talked about Occupy, strike debt, and the daily life of a person like myself. I told him about my art. He told me about his work as a consultant for JP Morgan Chase, where he was Jamie Dimon's assistant at one point. I told him about my desire to understand debt. He spoke of his guilt for working at Lehman Brothers leading up to 2008. He offered to let me be his assistant so I could see it from the inside. I told him maybe he should become a teacher. He said he likes photography and might like to do a photo project about unemployment. I told him that sounded very problematic. At the end of the conversation, he went to sleep. But I couldn't sleep. So I brought my little debt out of my backpack. I had this very clear thought. I was going to make an investment. Just before landing, he opened his eyes. I told him that I wanted to give him something I made. When I put the debt in his hand, he already understood what it was. I explained anyway, and he took a picture of me holding my debt with his iPhone. The flash went off, so my image was almost indistinguishable. It looked like this. His eyes got a little damp. I wondered if anyone had given him anything this heavy lately. After that exchange, the feeling shifted, at least for me. I felt like I'd taken a risk, maybe the first real risk since my debt. It would have been nice if he just handed me his credit card or checkbook. But I reminded myself of that experiment they did on British children that revealed how children who did not need immediate gratification, those who did not need a small, crappy snack now because they knew there would be a larger, better snack if they waited, those patient children ended up being more successful than the kids who couldn't wait and took the small, crappy snack. We didn't talk about money or what he could offer in exchange for my debt. He offered me a ride home from JFK, though, but I didn't actually know where I would be staying, so I didn't accept. Over the coming months in New York, we'd meet occasionally for dinner. Or his driver would pick me up from whatever basement I was staying in whatever neighborhood, and bring me to Manhattan. And I would show him what I was working on. I shared with him the Debt Resisters Operations Manual by Strike Debt. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but we should talk about it. He was in the process of interviewing for a new job at a new bank, but he didn't tell me which one. Without a doubt, it was one benefiting from the financial crisis. The following year, I went on a research residency to Washington, D.C., and the theme of my research was supposed to be outer space. At our welcome dinner, I was introduced to an astronomer, and as a part of his personal introduction to me, he pulled a rock out of his pocket. He also carried his rock with him everywhere. It was so small, but so heavy. It was still warm from his pocket. It was a meteorite from space, and his friend had found it in a desert and given it to him. Now his friend was dead. He said he carries it everywhere.
Do you know what this is worth?
No idea.
Can you tell me what it's made of?
Iron?
Good guess, but you're wrong. What do you do?
Well, I could just show you. And then I took the rock out of my pocket. Do you know what this is?
Brass?
It's debt.
You made debt?
Well, I didn't make debt, but it arrived.
Arrived from where?
I don't know. Where do you think debt is from? There he is, Professor Geller. I spent the rest of my time in Washington, D.C. in offices of museums and institutions that I met from Professor Geller, speaking with space scientists about the potential of debt as a material from space. An equation appeared to me where space, debt, and the unconscious might be all equivalent, unknown materials. This debt I made was as mysterious to me as were the nether regions of my own mind, but even more so of the vastness that surrounds the finite earth and my infinitely smaller experience of it. I'd like to invite space to come forward. Outer space, are you out there somewhere?
Yes, I am here. You couldn't see me. I couldn't see you.
No, I could not see you. Like me, you're invisible. People have to trust the economists that we exist. You know, lately I'm renting my home in the people's unconscious. It's so cheap. Meanwhile, I'm informing sociality, decision-making, a sense of human potential, and even what's possible. I offer great promises to anyone who gets to know me, and meanwhile I present a looming threat of having without owning and owing without ever being able to pay back. I'm dead.
Well, I am unknowable because of distractions like you, but never invisible. Luckily, people trust the scientists that I exist. The notion of infinity outside of Earth informs your sense of human potential and what is possible, a vast sense of possibility as well as threat.
Well, I hold immeasurable power over humans by instilling fear and organizing behavior, but not without opportunities for immediate hope and growth.
I captivate people, and and offer hope and fear to the entire collective. Asteroids may be the thing that saves you by providing resources that help you expand space exploration and the possibility of colonization. I threaten you with the possibilities of collision, and the very threat might save people from turning towards financial instruments like yourself for their thrills.
I don't understand what you describe when you discuss threat. The only threat I offer is to the debtor, who risks being criminalized or jailed if they cannot pay me back. And in many cases, the US government supports this by guaranteeing payback to the creditor.
The threat of an asteroid hitting Earth presents an urgent threat. There are infinite others. How would you service a loan from inside a steaming crater?
In the winter of 2012, during the US budget debate about the debt ceiling, a meteor shower hit Russia, injuring more than 1,000 people. Over and over again, the American public was pushed and pulled by the drama of the debt ceiling, a fictional prop used to organize and limit what we would talk about as possible this year. You may see the debt ceiling surrounding the Earth where the ozone layer used to be. Promises of worldwide crisis, with a total foreclosure of all global economic possibilities, were threatened if America did not raise the debt ceiling. Meanwhile, more natural disasters had taken place this year than in any other year in recorded history. Actual ceilings had crashed in over people's heads all over the world, but in the US, we preserved the illusion of the most important and dangerous ceiling of all being made of debt. "40 years ago, when the Apollo astronauts visited the moon, they understood it to be a rock, a bone-dead rock. On the day NASA announced that they had found 200 kilograms, or about a dozen 1-gallon buckets of water on the surface of the moon, I learned my dad was sick. 'This is not your father's moon. This is not a dead planetary body,' was the quote on top of space.com. My dad's name is Mark. Mark is a chosen parent. I always had him, and it didn't matter why or how. We're two people in a hard landscape who just figured things out as we went. When Mark first had a heart attack a year earlier, he hesitated for 48 hours before going to the emergency room. He'd worked loyally for the same print shop for 3 decades, but more recently business had gone downhill, stopped paying him, cut off his insurance. While in the hospital, Mark was very forthright in describing to all the staff and doctors that he had no money or insurance, requesting that they be mindful of that when deciding how long to keep him and which procedures to undertake. They kept him 5 days, cut him open twice, and billed him $89,000. He didn't want to repeat that experience. This time, he'd started to see blood in his urine, which turned into all blood, no urine. The blood had clotted, blocking the urethra. He didn't want to go to the doctor. He didn't feel bad, except that he was so uncomfortable and scared that he sat awake for 2 days, not moving or letting anything in or out. After the surgery, his second surgery, his boss called and said, "Well, like this is supposed to be comforting. You can't squeeze water out of rocks. Like they can't get you for anything. You can't squeeze water out of rocks. You can't get water from a stone. You can't squeeze water out of a stone." I think we're living in a hard landscape. But I'm trying to prove that there's water in the rocks. The hardness is made through a process of accumulation that's so subtle, yet so constant, that no human being perceived it until recently. The accumulation is of a material called debt. Debt has made the rocks. Some people trade the rocks on the stock market, but no one yet really understands how to squeeze them to get the real value. So I had this dream, and I was in a spatial relationship to all of my family members, all of my parents, which there are many. The tension between them was so hard that I could almost see it. The force of history and routine drew them towards each other, but all of the years of non-communication and selfish decisions between them kept pushing them apart. I felt like I was the only thing keeping them in each other's orbits. I had some sort of indescribable cue to look at the sky. And sure enough, a meteor shower began raining down on all of us. The falling stars broke the interpersonal friction that had permeated the initial moments of the dream. Imminent danger from an unknown force shifted our personal anxieties to a greater collective fear. Stars had fallen and extinguished the social anxieties and interpersonal tensions that I was raised with, but in the end, everyone was reduced to a bloody mess. It was so amazing how clear my imagination understood what it would look like to be touched by the heavens in this way. The United States designates people who travel above an altitude of 50 miles as astronauts. However, the line between Earth and space is not officially determined. So far, 107 billion people have been born, but currently, we are 7.5 billion. Now, I did the math, and that means that there are 99.5 billion dead people somewhere. The total number of astronauts is undocumented. The physical form of death for most people is the very dense blackness that fills everything between planets. Death does not result in emptiness. It's actually a hard vacuum containing a low density of particles, predominantly a plasma of hydrogen and helium. Outer space is made of dead people. The great unknown is a functioning cemetery. And the stars, they're markers of notable interactions among the dead. Space is not a place of calm. Among the extreme temperatures and turbulent winds, there are dead people who are in violent disagreement with each other. For every conflict, there's a star. The brightest light is coming out of the heat produced from the most profound conflicts. It's the pessimists with the broken ideals up there, battling with the dumb American entrepreneurs and their obsession with potential. It's an intergenerational war, a religious war, a war between spirits from different time periods. It's a philosophical war abstracted from land or water or resources or greed held by people without even human bodies. It's some deep shit. It's the amazing inability of dead people to compromise, be happy, or have fun that makes the night sky so fascinating to watch or to study. It's a war zone up there, and all of astronomy and astrology benefit. The outstanding conflicts between the dead create heat, light, and sometimes other things. They don't stay lit permanently, though from our perspective, it feels like they do. Sometimes it feels like nothing is changing or could ever change, but no state in the sky stays that way forever. Upon being evicted from a mission apartment that I had for 3 years, I got an art studio in Northern California because I won a residency at the Headland Center for the Arts, where I wrote this. Sometimes I feel like being at a residency is a little bit too cozy for me. Sometimes I almost thrive on fiscal anxiety or winds of work. So at this residency, I was having a kind of a hard time focusing. I did a lot of anxious online shopping where I didn't buy anything. But one day I was on a walk in the mountains near the beach, and you don't really get phone reception up there. But somehow my phone buzzed, and it was an email alert from Chase Bank saying that my account was overdrawn. I immediately thought to invite that guy, Jackson, that I'd met on the airplane to my studio. The same day, I found this article in space.com, and it explained how the Big Bang is now a passé scientific concept. That's a 2D cup. So this article says that the universe is actually 4D, and everything that we experience in 3D is just a shadow of the 4D. So a cup of coffee is a shadow of a 4D thing, which is what is real. And I was feeling really frustrated with myself, like, why can I not understand this? What would it take to begin to see and understand these things and that are not, and to think in ways that are not associated with my own economic survival? So I went home or to my studio, and I began to research or look at pictures of holes made by meteors in walls. Specifically, I was looking for walls like in banks and stuff. But what I found is that in 2003, in a town right by where I grew up, this kid named Robert had a meteor shoot through his bedroom and break through 3 walls, almost killing him, really, but not. And I don't know, I became really fixated with this story. And so I made a painting, my first painting, of a hole made by a meteor in a wall. And this is kind of how I survived. I made many paintings like this. This is how I sort of survived my residency, making nervous paintings. And so I called that guy Jackson, and I told him I wanted to give him a painting that he could put in his new office, which he now told me was at a hedge fund, a really bad hedge fund. And I felt like once, when I had originally given him that debt, which was sort of like a meteorite and sort of like a weapon to me, like he didn't really get how serious I was. And I think that by giving him this image, I really hoped that I was being a little bit clearer about my intentions for him to participate in the epic crash that I was imagining. So he works at Fortress Hedge Fund, and this painting that I was showing you is on the wall of his office, and I haven't seen it yet, but I imagine that I hope that it would look something like this. So now, that's the reading from the book. And I don't know how much more time I have, but I could talk about some projects. Is there time still? Oh, okay. Oh, cool. Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much. So, let's see, my brain. Okay, well, I've been thinking a lot for years now about how debt and finance make an impact which is much more profound than it is numerical. The way that it affects our unconscious and our sense of what's possible and the way that we talk to other people and what we do. That's what I've been thinking about for a long time. And I've worked with a group called Strike Debt, and as soon as I got out of grad school, we started Strike Debt in New York, and now it's a national organization. And there's one in Portland that's really blossoming. And if you're interested in participating in debt resistance as like a theoretical or practical concept, it's an amazing group. And there's an online PDF called the Debt Resisters Operations Manual you can download. I see a shaking head, so it's totally familiar to you guys. And we've done projects like the Rolling Jubilee, and now we have a new project called the Debt Collective. We could talk about that later. Anyway. So, as I had said before, somehow we made $3.4 million of debt, and I was really curious when I was in grad school, like how I could make an infographic that would explain the proportions. Like, we made this much debt and we made this much art, because I thought that the ratio would be kind of funny, if nothing else, but definitely illuminating about what was really going on. And so I really wanted to find out how much debt we had, but nobody would tell me how much debt they had. And then I went to the financial aid office, and they wouldn't tell me how much debt we had, and I went to the president and the business office, and I went everywhere I could. Do we hear that buzzing? Is it annoying? It's a light bulb. It's okay. And so I could not find out how much debt we had. So I was really racking my brain with what kind of trick I could do to figure it out. And finally, one day, I was just talking to my friend, Megan, and she said, I was like, well, okay, so if you were gonna make debt, like what would you make it out of? Because I don't ever make stuff, so I was curious. And she said, well, my debt would be like a big metal ball that follows me around wherever I go. Like it'd be like just about the size of me, and when I looked at it, it probably would go away, but it's like always in my peripheral vision. And I so felt that. I was like, yeah, that's probably mine too. And then after that, she was like, I have $64,000 of debt. And so then I was like, okay, this is what we've got to do. We've got to figure out a metaphor so that it's okay to talk about debt. And then once we talk about it, I can find out how much money there is, and then maybe we can do something with it. So this became my obsession, and this became a thing that I called debt visualizations. So this was like the second one I did, and this is just the notes that I took, because I never really videoed or recorded any of these. I just took notes on what people said. This person had about $225,000 of debt. She imagined that her debt was like this black metal or black metallic thing coming out of the earth, like slow, like as it, yeah, it came out of the dirt, and as it came towards her, it was going slowly in a plane above her head, and it was like at this weird angle that felt really precarious. Like it could just fall, but it probably won't. It's probably infinitely strong, but it's blocking the light from her, and she knows that real life is happening all around it, but like not for her. And this is this like really savvy art person, and we're talking, and she was like, God, it just, when I'm picturing it, it looks like a Richard Serra sculpture. And we're like, oh my God, like your debt is a Richard Serra. That's so gross, but it makes so much sense. So it's like, Richard Serra is this most productive and expensive artist who's made such an impact on the art world, and I couldn't help but think that maybe he was actually making physical manifestations of debt. And so like, this is such a good example of that, where like, who the hell knows how long it's gonna stay up? Like it could just fall on you at any time, and it's sort of right over your head when you're standing next to it. It's about, you know, person size. And who put it there, and are they certified, and how can we guarantee that it's gonna stay up? Oh, well, the institution is holding it up. How long is that gonna last? Like, it was so interesting to sort of begin to look at debt for all of these kinds of reasons, and really question, like, I don't know, what is it? So, talking to more and more people, I found out that a lot of people saw similar things. Another common thing that people imagined when they saw their debt was fog. So like, it's all around them and they can't see, and they try to sweep it away, but it keeps coming back, and you can't condense it, and you can't clear it, and it's blocking your vision and sort of informing the way you see everything. That's a thing. And so I began to think of this as hypnotherapeutic anthropology. I really have not had good experiences in therapy. I don't really believe in it because I think that it's really individualizing. But there was something helpful happening, and people would call me in the middle of the night and ask me if I would come do their debt visualization. And I traveled with it. I've done it with a lot of different people now, and it seems like it's sort of helpful to develop a language around it that's abstract, but that lets you talk about it in a different way. However, the other side of it is the anthropological side, which is that I'm learning so much about like what debt is for people. And then I get to share it. So every time that I do a debt visualization, I can compare like, well, you know, a lot of people see themselves surrounded by an invisible cloak when they imagine their debt, or like a lot of people imagine themselves climbing an infinite monolith that's poisoned all the soil, and you know, like I think it can be useful. And so I am developing an archive, and you can look at that online from my website. Go away. Nope. So at one point I went to New York, and as I was saying in that story, I had like gotten all these shows, and so one of the first ones was a show called To Have and To Owe, which is just this amazing exhibition where I made a little bit of work, but like the main point of it was that tons of people that were thinking about debt, like theorists and activists and historians and all kinds of people were coming and giving talks about debt every day for 2 months. And so one of my favorite writers came, Annie McClanahan, and she writes about debt and student movements, and she's really inspiring. And one of the things that she writes is that when we all have so much debt that we could never possibly repay it, and it's across the board, it's everybody, we don't even know what it is. It's not debt anymore, it's something else. And she believes it's actually just this huge opening for solidarity. It is solidarity, debt is solidarity itself. But she's, kind of made herself an art historian. She's a real anthropologist, an amazing writer, a researcher, and we did a depth visualization. And she imagines herself, I asked people to imagine themselves in a familiar outdoor place, and they often find themselves outside of their parents' house. And she did. And she's walking down the street towards her mother's house. And I ask her lots of questions, like, is there anything weird? Do you see any people around? We're just going through the motions as she's walking down the street, and she's like seeing that everybody has newspapers that are all the same, wrapped up like a regular New York Times on their stoop, and it's all very uniform. Every single stoop has this, and she's like, I just want to see what it is. So she picks up the newspaper off the floor, off the ground, takes the plastic wrapping off, and she realizes that it's an ancient newspaper. Like, it's been saturated by water and dried and saturated and dried till the ink had been completely like soaked into the paper. And she could still see that there was some sort of text on it, but it was a text she could not recognize in any way. And she felt very like confused by that in her imagination she produced something she couldn't even understand, even though her whole life is devoted to understanding the hardest stuff. And so she feels like, oh my God, somebody might be seeing that I'm not understanding this, and they might be thinking that I'm stealing this person's newspaper. And she felt really embarrassed, and she quickly put the newspaper back in the plastic bag, put it down, and like hustled away. And she wanted to she kept making sure that nobody was following her. And it was so interesting to think of this person whose whole life is based on understanding the written word. When debt comes into the room, she can't understand anything, and she's so embarrassed of that. She was ashamed and afraid. So there's definitely some patterns. This is kind of more of a joke than it is a real representation of what people see, but these are all things people see. But just to say that there are really specific patterns in terms of what people are seeing when they see their debt. And so I, in the last couple of years, got to the point where I was kind of ready to focus on different groups of people to do their debt visualizations and to understand how it's, might affect one type of person more than another. And so I proposed that I was going to do this residency in Miami, and I wanted to do it for wealthy financial workers. Like, how do they see debt? So it was an epic experience. And so basically, I met one investment banker who introduced me to his sort of world of friends. And I ended up meeting with 7 people, hedge fund managers, large foundation managers, an investment banker, and some corporate lawyers. I think that's it. And I went to their houses and to their offices, and the houses were the fanciest houses I'd ever been in. And I really tried to be convincing and do a debt visualization with each of them. And it was really challenging because when you're in art school and you want to do something weird, big deal. All of a sudden, I'm in this hedge fund manager's office, and we have 20 minutes, and I have to do this convincingly. And like, how did he even let me in there? So the first person that I met with is this woman, an investment banker. This woman who is a corporate lawyer, and she tells me about how she grew up poor, and we talked just about her general financial state of being, and she feels very at risk, even though she's obviously very wealthy. And the risk comes from the idea that she is responsible for her parents' well-being because she grew up poor and the family doesn't have any money. Her parents didn't have retirement savings. Like, she pays their rent. And she kept saying over and over again, she couldn't stand the idea that like something could happen. And if something could happen, she could ruin all the comfort, all the comfort that she'd been experiencing now could be ruined. And so this sort of infinite risk is where we went. Soon after, she told me that she signed the merger that made the world's largest private prison company. So that is that fear of insecurity is what is generating this desire or this ability to continue doing this work. It's a lot to unpack. So I have her close her eyes and imagine herself in a familiar outdoor area. She finds herself on Miami Beach, right outside of her house, and she starts to see jellyfish. And she sees jellyfish that have like overpopulated the beach. And she says, like, I've heard that this has happened because of climate change. And it's so disappointing because the jellyfish, they don't even share the beach with us anymore. And she talked very scientifically about, like, you know, these are moon jellies. They're not really poisonous. They're mostly really beautiful, but they can sting you. And so she's walking around the beach and kind of talking about how beautiful and majestic the jellyfish are, but also how dangerous they were. And, you know, she's been stung before and she could be stung again. So actually, why doesn't somebody just come here and clean all these jellyfish up? And she got herself worked into a real tizzy, and it was so interesting because it's like these things which were so alluring to her were also so dangerous to her. And eventually, she just says, I'm just gonna sit down. I'm gonna sit down on the beach and just chill out for a second. She even said at one point, obviously, I've got a thing with jellyfish that I didn't realize. And so she's like, you know, talking a lot about her responsibility to the jellyfish here. She picks the jellyfish up and looks at the light through it, and then she's like, you know, I should really put it back in the water, but I kind of want to kill it. Like, so she sits down on the ground. She imagines scooping up a handful of sand, and she sees that she's actually walking around in her own hand. So she's shrunk. And she's looking up at herself, and her big self can't see her little self because she's too small. And she's like in this mountain range of sand on her hand. And she's like, well, my big self wouldn't really care about my little self if I couldn't see her. And it was like, oh shit. Did you just hear yourself say that? So anyway, she imagines, I think to close out her debt visualization, she imagined that she put herself down on the ground on a little shell so she could still see the ocean. She put her little self down, and then she realized that there was a huge jellyfish right next to her that was much bigger than her. So I'm gonna tell you one other debt visualization by a financial worker. This was a different person who was an investment banker who worked like on the 15th floor of this all-white building, and I went and met him up there, and we were up in the sky looking down at everybody, and he had like no imagination. We talked about debt, and he said, you know, I've never given a loan. I would never give a loan without the proper paperwork. I would never give a loan to a friend. I don't have any debt. I know it's a thing. Like, I trade it, but I don't use it. And he described himself as risk averse, but there was a little bit of drama around it. He was sorry about it, I think because I was in the room, but he imagined himself at some generic park in Miami. I don't know, I'm just at a park. And then he says, well, I'm just walking around in the grass, and like he doesn't know what to do, and I'm very successful at getting people to imagine things, but he does not take any of the superpowers I give him or anything. And finally, I'm like, could you just imagine what's below your feet? Like, what's underneath the grass? And he's like, well, there's dirt. And I was like, well, what if you sink into the ground? And he's like, okay, so I'm sinking into the ground. And immediately he hits limestone, and there's nowhere else to go. And he's just like, won't imagine anything. I'm kind of like, dude, we have 22 minutes left. Like this, you know, I don't know. I was feeling really anxious, and I think he could tell. So he tried to like turn it up a notch. And he's like, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to get up, and I'm going to climb a tree. And I was like, oh, cool, what kind of tree? And he's like, it's a banyan tree. And I'm like, oh, shit. Because you know what about banyan trees? The way they grow is that, I have a good picture, is that birds drop seeds onto other trees, and the seeds grow these vines that sort of circle the original tree, and they suffocate it and kill it. And then all that's left eventually, after the old tree rots, is that it's this hollow tree. So like the tree of life is this kind of scary thing. It's hollow. But I mean, obviously animals can live in it and stuff. But anyway, he imagines himself climbing the artifice of a tree, a hollow, carnivorous tree, basically. And he's climbing up it, and the whole way he's describing all of the danger he encounters, like, oh, well, it seems like if I grab this branch, it might fall, so I won't grab that, but I'm gonna find a good foothold and make it all the way up. And now I'm 2/3 of the way. That's about 70% of the way up this tree, and I don't think I'm gonna go any further because, well, the risk outweighs the benefit of going any further. And he stops. I'm like, okay. So then he's just stopping there, and he's telling me how he's looking down at all the women and children playing in the park, and he's just watching them, and he's different than them because he's up in the tree and they're down on the ground doing stuff. And then I asked him, well, do you want to try to fly or jump off the tree, or is there something else? And he was like, oh, no way, I could get hurt. And so then he describes himself, very carefully coming all the way down. And we finish, and he opens his eyes to check his email really quick, and he's like, oh my God, I didn't mean that thing about how I was up in the tree looking down at the women and children. And then I was like, yeah, it was really funny when you said that. And he goes, well, I gotta go. But the other thing that's really weird is that I said that the risk outweighed the benefit of going any higher. And I was like, yeah, it was pretty weird. It was pretty funny. And then he had to go. So I made piñatas of all the things that the different financial workers saw. So this is the banyan tree and the jellyfish, and there were actually quite a few other visualizations that involved a piece of black slate, a guy that battled with liquidity itself, and a very spiky rose. And I had everyone sitting underneath these things in this very, very clean storefront in Miami. And I filled the piñatas with things which were very, very real, like soil gathered at the perimeter of this huge construction site. Oh, no, sorry, this is the soil gathered in front of the Juvenile Justice Center. Rubble from underneath this huge construction site for basically huge luxury condos and hotels that were replacing, all just homes, a little neighborhood. Leaves collected from a banyan tree in front of the federal courthouse. And then these little styrofoam Cuban coffee cups that were seen, they were just really ubiquitous in Miami for Cuban coffee. And then little those little drink umbrellas, I put those in some of the piñatas. And so this is the invitation for the party. And all of the people that I interviewed came, as well as a lot of the artists that I met. And we were in an area which was the club zone of Miami. And there was a lot of people that could sleep outside there because they just appeared to be club kids. So whatever, there was club kids and homeless people all over the street all the time. So I had gotten to know them, so they came. And so we had this really exhaustive lecture by me about debt, because nobody had ever heard about debt before as a thing you could talk about. And meanwhile, they're sitting underneath these investors and hedge fund managers' ideas of debt. And so I talked for an hour like this, just never ending. And then finally and I had everyone do a debt visualization together. And while everyone's eyes were closed, I had the people that I'd interviewed, the financial workers, come to the front so that when everybody opened their eyes, they were at the front of the room and they talked about their debt visualization experience and their personal finance, their sort of way of thinking about debt. And so it was a very, very electric room. People really wanted to kill those people that were standing at the front that were finance workers. And so when we couldn't wait any longer, I just sat and held space and put on ABBA, Money, 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 really loudly, and I grabbed a stick and I just went for it and hit one of these things. And everybody else found whatever they could. There were sticks around the room and chairs, and people just went crazy on these piñatas. This looks yeah. But it was people were beating them until there was nothing left. People by themselves. The music was off at one point, and there was one woman that was just beating and beating and beating. And the interns and I took these little cups, the styrofoam cups and stuff that were inside of the piñatas, and we filled it up with the rubble that was on the floor and made little giveaways. And it was so crazy because you'd see, everybody kind of wanted a souvenir, so you'd see like the, people in suits on the floor filling up their cups to make their souvenir. And then this is the next day, what was left. And it was just such a clean place before we did this. There's a dead rose. And so this art institution that I was there doing a residency with, they had a group of school children visiting the next day. So they visited the space like this. So that's that. Now, I think I'm not going to talk about this last project because we're about out of time, right? Is that a... Okay, yeah, that sounds good. So do you guys know what a credit report is? So in most states, like a job employer can look at it, but like everywhere, landlords look at them. If you need a loan, if you need a surgery, if you need a car, everybody looks at your credit report, but your credit report is kind of a joke. Anyway, in working with a lot of radical people, I realized that they're very conservative in the way that they take care of their own finances, and maybe they're not even confronting their own finances at all, because they're very afraid of the consequences. For instance, striking against their debt. One of the main consequences is that your credit report could be destroyed, and you could be really, at risk of not being able to get an apartment. At least that's the story. We know that we can get apartments, but it's hard. So a big part of credit reporting is basically selling people's identities. And everybody is sort of a part of the system in the United States. But the FBI actually is the main funder of the technology that we use today. So it seems like a small inconvenience, but I actually think it's a monstrous system that maintains a level of obedience that we can't even yet see. And so the sort of convoluted relationship between a person's trustworthiness or integrity and their credit score is a real thing. And I think that we look at each other, you could be standing in front of a landlord and they're like, okay, well, I know you're like a full-time teacher and all of this, but like, could you just give me a PDF of your credit score before I trust you? Or, it's really funny how we can kind of boil down our integrity to a number. So I've been tabling with a big sign that looks like this. It says, bad credit does not mean bad person. And that's too much information. But okay, so maybe you guys have heard of the Debt Collective or the Corinthian 15. And if you haven't, you should look it up. Because I think it's a really revolutionary moment in terms of what's going to happen with higher education. And so I was involved at the beginning of this with a group of 15 people who went to a for-profit college, and the for-profit college was basically condemned by the Department of Education. They said, this is a bad school and we're going to close you down, but you still have to pay us back our debts, or pay your debts. So meanwhile, the education is worth nothing, but you still are saddled with tons of debt, and you didn't learn anything. So these people striked publicly against their debt, and now it's a much larger group striking. But one implication of that is obviously when you strike against your debt, you don't have the ability, you're striking against your credit as well. So it's really hard to kind of continue. So there was a lot of worry and fear around this. And I've been thinking about doing credit reports, alternative credit reports before anyway, but this was a great chance to begin again. So this is actually a credit report of one of the people that is a member of the Corinthian 15. And basically, this is a very, very simple project, and I would love it to become a viral writing project. And so I'm gonna invite any of you guys that are interested to talk to me or Miranda or go to this website. But basically, what I do when somebody needs a credit report, say you don't have a credit card and you need to get an apartment, and so you don't have a credit score. Well, I would interview you. I would look at your resume and ask you questions like, oh, I see you've had a job for 10 years, but all of a sudden you didn't have a job. Like, what happened? Or like, when you, I see on your, with a person that has a credit report and a resume, I would look at both documents and ask them questions about like the story that those documents don't tell, and then create a document that explains sort of their story embedded with like their larger goals as well as their current situation and some references, and so that they, in the end, have a document to hand to a landlord, an employer, even like somebody used it to get their utilities turned back on, so that you have some sort of document that represents the fact that you are a person with integrity beyond the narrative that the documentation that's created for you says. And it's been like the best experience possible to be able to give these to people. We were just talking about it last night. Like, I don't actually, this one says alternative credit report. I think a lot of them now say auxiliary credit report, but they're not visual and they're not special. They're very almost invisible documents. They just are the most basic pieces of telling the story of somebody. And a lot of people, when they pass them to a landlord or whatever, they actually lie and say they made them, which I think is great because it's actually like their story, they're owning. They edit it with me, but it's theirs, and now they're saying like, I put in this extra effort to do this, take me, or give me this thing that I need. Anyway, so it's been a really rich project that really feels like it's just beginning, and so give us cred. Yeah.
If you guys see in the middle, the third category, explanation of credit history, an explanation of Everest, the for-profit school from which X obtained her medical coding license, has since been closed and is being sued for fraud. The idea that that narrative information that provides context, that's not going to show up on a credit report, and yet that's so determinative.
Well, and this is a very shortened version. Actually, the one that she uses is quite a bit bigger, and it has a little bit of information about her family. And because, with many people, with everybody, their stories are so complex, and it's like, I can't believe you've lived through all this, and you're such a strong and amazing person, and you're still fighting to survive in this amazing way. And so she's such an amazing example of a person that has lived through so much, who's now doing such righteous work. And I really, in her main credit report, it really comes out that it's like, wow, I want to have you as an employee because you're so, or I want to be around you because you're so amazing. And overall, every person I've done, I've only done 13, but every person has had such an amazing and impactful story. And then, it's like they've never seen it before. So anyway, that's the big last give us cred. So anyway, givemecred.com is the website for this project. And it would be an amazing viral writing project. I'm just gonna keep saying that. Cool, thank you guys.
I wanted to ask you something about the alternative credit report, or credit reporting in general. You sort of talk about how what these things can do is bring story elements, or parts of someone's story that don't normally enter into the proceedings, and reveal them to be good, multi-layered, amazing people that are worth valuing, right?
Yeah.
Why is it that being a good person should be a prerequisite for being able to get housing or a job?
It shouldn't be, right? It just so happens that, so the reason that credit reporting has become what it is that where it started was actually a hyper-objective, subjective process where you'd go into a credit bureau and you'd meet with somebody and they would like look at you and judge your clothes and your race and everything about you and then write you possibly like a really racist or rude document that they would update regularly, but there was no system to measure like accountability or to say like, you know, who should be able to write whose credit report is like such a good question. But the Fair Credit Reporting Act is in direct relation to that. Like that got so far out of control. So you know, maybe I overemphasize the amazingness of her character, but in general, I would say that the story is pretty simply that like whatever person it is, they probably had a medical emergency. You know, they probably had a medical emergency and had to stop working. Or they lived in a place, there was a guy that lived in a place and he lost his job and he couldn't find a job for like 4 years. And well, he lost his job in Cleveland, and that was the year that Cleveland had the highest unemployment of anywhere in the country, and it was in the service sector because a Ford plant had closed a couple years before. And so it's just about sort of bringing forward like the conditions, the common conditions, I think. And then the goodness just happens because people, like, I'm just like, what? Like, I cannot believe that you are still fighting so hard when all of this shit has happening to you. What's up?
Knowing what you know now about student debt, would you have avoided the whole system to begin with in the first place if you did not?
No. I mean, people ask me this a lot, and like, I'm not gonna pay my dad's back. I'm just not going to. Even if I could, I wouldn't. Somebody offered to give me like a personal loan that would pay my debts, at least half of it off, and then I could just pay them back, and I was like, I would never do that to you. Like, cause anyway, yeah, so I don't regret it. I'm really glad that I got my education, and I would say that for other people, it's just, I think looking closely at the education system now is much easier, and it's really important to just look at the situation that you're participating in and like where that money is going. But we still want educations, and the government is very willing to fund imprisonment. Like at least in California, like they're shelling out like $45,000 a person for so many people. Like just take it as a scholarship, like to do what you really want, because otherwise that money's going to go to something so much worse. Yeah.
I'm loving everything you're saying. I'm just wondering, you gave us a lot of good resources, but if there's any other artists or writers or any who's working with this type of data, like as this concept that you wanted to share with us?
Yeah. Well, I just got put in this little book that Miranda has now, and it's called A Soft Spot in a Hard Place, and it's organized by this guy Zach Goff, but like Max Haven is a writer, and he's at NASCAD in Halifax, and NASCAD, I mean, if you're really interested in it, like, it would be a great place to go visit and see, because there's, like, a whole sort of, like, finance and art department, and they're doing all of this work as a community in Halifax, driven by Max, which is about imagining a future without debt. And so, I mean, there's actually so many people now that are doing amazing stuff. I'm trying to think of, like, where the central, like, the nexus point for that stuff would be. Maybe we need something. If you email me, you should just email me and I'll send you stuff. I have like PDFs coming out of my butt about it.
What about Debtors Anonymous? Have you worked with them at all?
No, and I've never, and I always think about like capitalism as an addiction, but I've never.
Well, but I think about this idea of it also being something about being a bad person, and the question of, does character have anything to do with your credibility? And I think also of this idea that to personalize and humanize us in the face of misfortune or wrong turns, also is with employment, it's the same thing, that people, there was an article in the Sunday Times, I think, about, I can't remember what country it was, but I know it is the case here as well. When you've been unemployed for so long, your self-esteem is so impacted that it's really difficult to consider yourself employable. So the same kind of thing. And I think Debtors Anonymous is the same. It's actually a 12-step, some of it's addiction, but some of it has to do with a sense of being a credible person.
Right, right,
So,
right. And seeing yourself among others like you.
right.
Right. So is there a question there? Like,
I just was wondering if you worked at all with that part.
No, but you know, the whole framework of strike debt has become about the debtors' assembly, which is not that different in terms of revealing yourself to others as a debtor and explaining your situation, and then everybody seeing you and then seeing themselves next to you, and then we fit in a whole lot of, like, you know, economic critique and sort of, you know, we bring in other voices to kind of contextualize that, so it doesn't seem like it's like we were just a bunch of failures sitting around talking with each other, but like, you know, we bring in people to bring in some other sorts of political narratives or whatever. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of at the basis of it, or at the core of it. So.
I guess I'm wondering about how you've been like working through the problematics of like being someone that lives in a capitalist society and also like trying to do this work, like if like how you charge for stuff like debt visualizations, or like how you deal with those issues.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, I don't charge for anything really. Like, I'm getting paid to be at this lecture, and I've been paid by a lot of institutions to visit and talk about debt. But I offer a lot of, like, all of my services are usually free so far, almost to a fault. Like, I don't know if that's the best situation or not, but I've accepted some barters, but most of those haven't really played out. I don't know, you know, it's definitely, sustainability is something that I'm really thinking about. And so, you know, I am wondering how to kind of continue to do this without just, like, getting sponsored by some awful company or something, you know? But it's just such tender material with people, because I want so much to be somebody that can create an experience of like really radical, like, trust and patience with people, where they don't feel like they're gonna get scammed or the rug pulled out from underneath them. So it's kind of dangerous, you know, for me at times, but I feel like in general, I've just done whatever it takes to, like, keep enough money and materials flowing in my artwork from working other jobs, so that I can just, like, let that be without relying on it for money. But yeah, it's such a good question. I don't know, you know, if you get any ideas, call me.
You said that you just mentioned like waiting for your little debts to be finished, that, you know, you didn't wait for all of them to be finished. And I see like a sort of cultural critique, but also like a personal critique in that, you know, of like impatience. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, what your, I guess, like, personal, how you deal with those personal critiques. And then, I'm not sure if this is totally related, it might be a separate question, but if, like, where you see your work in relation to time, like, in imagining a world without debt.
Yeah, totally. Such a good question. I mean, when you think about, like, the impact that debt has on our sense of time, it's like, you know, it brings the future to you, like, right now. You know, you don't have to, like, work up to something in that old-fashioned idea of, like, saving up. Like, you don't have to do that. You just now. And then immediately, though, I think that because the future comes to you now, like, you begin, the future becomes really close to your consciousness, because you're automatically plotting how you're going to make the money to pay it back. So I really do think it's just this amazing time condenser. And, you know, supposedly people's eyes are moving closer to the front of their head because they're so used to looking forward, you know, and I think that finance really contributes to that. Like, we're just so forward facing because we have to kind of pay back, you know, or make up for whatever we've just destroyed by getting the thing that we should have waited for now. But in terms of my personal kind of journey with this, I just grew up just in, everything was just made of debt. And so, I mean, I think I've been trained by it, you know, and so I'm very slowly like unraveling all of that stuff. But I was really kind of condemning myself when I was in grad school because I was learning about the stuff as I was still kind of exhibiting my old patterns. So, you know, really looking for like a product now, like, you know, I'm not used to a process, I just ready. And in terms of like a long-term, well, I guess striking debt and like changing that does seem like a really long-term project to me. And I get really frustrated within strike debt sometimes because there's a sense that like we need to like see change now. But I think that in order to shift like the broader culture and the government, or even just to like, I think that in strike debt we work really hard thinking on a large scale about policy and government and corporations. But if we had a profound change, like say there was a debt jubilee, like I'm really concerned that the next day everybody would just go back to Walmart. Like there'd be huge lines. Everybody would be like, finally I can spend money again. And they'd be just like in line to get the new iPhone, like get like 500 versions of it or whatever. And so to me, it has to be a slow change that involves everybody and everybody sort of sharing in this evolution towards like wanting different, better things that take time. So yeah, I mean, I just think it's just an epic project. And I can't believe how much has changed in a couple of years, but so much more has to change. Yeah.
I'm curious, since you said you're not paying back your debt or your student loans, the banks obviously aren't just gonna be like, oh, okay, like.
She's interesting.
Different. I was just wondering, like, what you do in response to their like threatening letters.
Yeah. Well, they've given like a lot of loopholes, which are, me and Miranda were talking about last night, how dangerous they actually are. So like, since I've gone to grad school, like income-based repayment has become this multifaceted program that you can join where 15% of your expendable income, you know, you can just pay that. And if, like me, most of my money does not come above board, it looks like I make very little money. I mean, I do make very little money, but it looks like I make even less. Then, like, I'm required to pay almost nothing. And so I do pay nothing. And it says that's what I'm supposed to do. But then I get a letter every once in a while that says how much accrued interest is added to my principal. And so, like, I just got one the other day that said I had an additional $17,000 added to my principal. So I think when I signed up for income-based repayment, I was a part of a loan consolidation that also had a higher interest rate. Additionally, I had paid off like, you know, almost $20,000 of debt from my undergrad before I went to grad school. But then when I went to grad school, they continued to charge me interest, which then was like $15,000 of interest. So basically, it just wiped out all of the debt I had paid off. So it's really like, I just don't, yeah, I mean, it's so easy for me to see that I'm not paying for my education. I'm just paying for, I'm just, yeah, paying interest upon interest upon interest. So I have no qualms not paying it. But, you know, with the strikers from the Corinthian 15, we had a very long conversation about what it means for each of them to strike, and everybody's on a different program. To strike for some people might mean to just like default all the way, like just like let your wages get garnished and just F it, just go all the way. And other people are like, well, I'm just gonna pay like this minimum amount to keep myself above water, or I'm only gonna pay every 6 months like just before, or 8 months, just before I go into default, and just stay just barely above water. So striking and not payment, unpayment, whatever you call it, I feel like there's a wide spectrum of what that can be.
I think you know that I love this project, and one of the things that you're able to do, and I think we've experienced it just in the short time we've had with you, is shift the scale on which debt operates, and with visualizations that happens. And one of the things that shift does is that what we usually experience as a kind of private moral failing gets collectivized. So it's a kind of collectivizing of vulnerability. And that is incalculable, the gain of collectivizing like that is. So I'm thinking a little bit about the Annie McClanahan observation that, well, actually, maybe this is a common condition of being indebted.
Yeah.
So I guess the question would be about whether you could tell us some more about the Feminist Economics Department, or the Fed.
Yeah. Well, since I was in grad school, like in 2010, I started to do projects that involved a lot of people. Like, even any of these projects that I showed you, like, there's so many people involved in making it happen. And I just started calling myself the Feminist Economics Department instead of using my name a lot. Just recently, like, my name kind of came back up. I think I wasn't policing enough. But, yeah, I mean, it was just sort of this idea that none of my projects are just me. And so I've started, like, an alternative security firm. I've run a sort of artist-run beauty salon to confront economic suffering. I've done a lot of, like, dance pieces where we, like, for instance, touch everything inside of the bank, just touch it. And all of those involved so many people, and so, like, all of these photographs that are taken, or like all of the recordings that are made, and all the invitations, and all the writing of the press releases, it's all so many people. And so that's why I wanted to be the Fed. I just wanted to kind of disappear my name a little bit. And also, I mean, I don't, like, that whole thing about being an artist, and it's like your image becomes so important, and it's so visible online, and I just don't want it. I mean, I still barely have a website, but I would like to not have one at all. And so recently I began the process of beginning the Feminist Economics Department as a space. And it failed miserably because there was somebody involved that really was obsessed with her own image. And so, I mean, it revealed itself in the process, and so it didn't work out. But, the Feminist Economics Department is always hiring, so.
Earlier you were talking about how debt resistance is both a theoretical and a practical project, which I think is really cool. And I'm also thinking about it now in terms it's addressing, like, the need for personal processing through, like, the debt visualizations, and also in doing that, everyone is engaging in an act of solidarity with each other's debt. And I guess I'm wondering if you think that, I find that that's not always the case in doing, like, trying to, like, address an issue. I think things end up in this dichotomy of either we're doing, like, personal work,
Right.
or we're doing direct action or something, and there's not always an obvious way of how to, like, engage both of those things at the same time. And I'm wondering if you think that that's able to happen because debt kind of lends itself to that, or that was an intention that you sort of had from the beginning, or and also I guess I'm wondering, like, if it could be applied in the same way to other areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it is the question to me. Like, how do you be a collective and be an individual at the same time, equally? I mean, yeah, I think it just applies to everything so much all the time. But, I mean, I have to say that that's always been my sort of personal struggle. Like, it's like such a desire for the collective. Like, the Feminist Economics Department was such a thing. Like, it was such a tool to try to, like, figure that out. But with debt, I think that it's really important specifically because it has the potential to isolate and shame people, which just picks them away from from any possibility of like a collective action, because you're so ashamed for being a failure, you can't see that everybody else is also in the same situation. That is it's quite precise, like that debt requires this flexibility between like I am me and I'm making these decisions, but I am making these decisions with everybody else. But I mean, any political movement right now, I feel like it's begging for that kind of energy. But it's such a trick, like how to do that. And I feel really lucky to have fallen into that process of the debt visualization where it's really easy for me to be one-on-one with people. And so, but it's like, by being one-on-one, we can talk about everybody else too, in a really safe way. So every debt visualization is so much like, we talk about the fog, and then we talk about your fog, and we talk about everybody's fog. I think we did it. Cool. Thank you.